Moonlight slides off a sable pelt and a humming stone as a lone king slips between the ash smoke of Mordor and the parched dunes of the Southlands. His arrival tastes of iron and rain on dry lips. The Black Panther brings a stolen heartstone and a single promise to break the chains that sell men and blood to the Dark Lord. And the price of that promise will force the proud and the fearful to choose. When rebellion begins under that midnight sigil, old oaths will crack and new reckonings will be born. He came down from the hidden marshes and reed-haunted paths of South March, where the nights gather like cloaks and the moon keeps silent counsel. The path he followed was a rag of stars and footsteps, worn where only those who feared trade and taxation would walk. His pelt drank the light, his steps made no sound on the salt-bleached track. On his chest, against the pitch of fur, the heartstone pulsed, a small thing, no larger than a fist, dark as wet coal, but alive with a sound like breath held at a grave. Men who had seen it once later swore the air shifted when the stone hummed. Birds fell quiet, embers leaned away, and the smallest lies inside a man's throat coughed and failed. From the heights of a black ridge, he saw the caravans. The wagons wound like a bone-colored river toward Mordor, each wheel a slow insistence. Lanterns blinked at intervals like beetles trapped in glass. Between the carts marched columns of men bound at wrist and ankle, heads bowed to the dust, faces set in the patient clay of those who have learned how to wait while their lives are sold. The guards rode in mail that kissed moonlight with a clean, cruel gleam. Banners, black and threaded with ash, snapped in a cold wind. That trade had roots everywhere, he knew. Camps in the east, secret barges at the appointed coves, lists written in cipher. Slavery ran like iron through the veins of the land, and Mordor provided the markets and the masters. He felt the truth of it as one feels a fever. Where others saw cargo and coin, he saw the hollow of names emptied, the slow theft of fathers and daughters, the invisible ledgers that made whole towns into profit and rumor. His promise to those men and women, those human flints dimmed to kindling, was not lofty speech. It was a hand laid on a pulse. "I will break your chains," he told the first of them when he slipped down to their line, and the words landed like stones to the feet of men used to hollow words. He did not call himself king with trumpets. He only moved through the ranks, letting the heartstone sing against his bare palm, and men felt old griefs unfreeze. Some still clung to oaths given to local lords or to long-remembered kings. Pride in those places was the stubborn burr that keeps a cloak from falling, and many in the Southlands had learned to measure power not by promise, but by the reach of a man's sword. So his claim to rule was not birthright, nor was it a claim to a throne of carved wood. His claim was a promise bound in action, the freeing of those bound and the undoing of a commerce that made grief pay its way to the gates of Barad-dûr. For some, that promise rang like salvation. For others, like a prodigal that would ruin the balance of trade and invite ruin. All measured him by what he did, and what he would do would be his coronation. He did not wait for dawn to make his choice. Dawn is a conspiring color in lands where tyranny sleeps with its eyes half open. He chose instead the night between two new moons, when the sky was a bowl of velvet and the ash smoke from Mordor lay like a linen sheet over the plain. The plan was as quiet as the step that climbed a thatchless roof. Find a single caravan, the one lagging with a broken axle and tired horses, cut the chain of commerce at its thinnest point, and let the ripple be a warning. His company was small. South March does not spare men where secrecy is needed. It lends a handful. Hunters, a locksmith whose hands did not tremble, a woman who could read the faces of centuries the way others read scripture. They crept like breathed shadows. At the edge of the caravan, the first notes of the hearthstone became visible. It did not shine like a lamp. Rather, it made the dark seem to gather itself. Watchmen blinked and cursed at shadows that were square and sensible when on duty, but began to slither like fish in water when the stone hummed. A sentry's whip hand jittered, the leather slipped. The locksmith moved, a small shadow within a shadow, and the iron of shackles yielded like old nails. Men woke to their wrists being opened as one wakes to a hand on a fevered brow. The sound of unlatched iron is a small, clean sound. It is as loud as a trumpet in the ears of those who have never heard freedom promised that close. They acted not with wild charge, but with precision. A rope cut here, a horse silently led away there. No man was struck down for show. The only violence bought was the throwing of a watch's lance into the sand when its owner reached for it with obstinate, clumsy certainty. One guard, roused by the hearthstone's hum, lifted his helm to shout a South March hunter, pressed a hand to the man's mouth, and the shout strangled into a curse and died. The freed did not flee at once. Some stood, blinking into the cold light, tasting air as if it were a new thing. Others, older men whose faces were gone to salt, dropped to their knees and wept without noise. One mother lifted a child that had not laughed in 3 years. The child's first laugh carried like a bright pebble dropped into stagnant water. It sundered the most patient despair. That sound, perhaps more than any defiant decree, announced that something had shifted. Word travels with such things in minutes. The nearby wagons rattled as if the plain itself had shifted. Lanterns were extinguished. The guards grouped and shouted with the fury of those who have been surprised at table. Horses screamed. A few shots were fired into the black. No one was killed. Outright wounds were taken, patched, hidden. We do not relish the sight of blood. In the telling, the night held to the law that kings prefer. Paint the event with purpose. Spare the grotesque edges. When the column finally broke, it revealed more than captive hands. Under a blanket of torn leather, they found tally stones, small bits of carved bone marked with numbers and runes. They found straps stamped with the black ring of Mordor, the same mark at every trade point, the same inked sigil on travel papers folded into secret pockets. A ledger, thick with entries, rested under a guard's cloak. It named places and weeks and the price of a man's labor. It listed the lords of the Southlands who took coin to look away. The book was a heavy thing. When the Panther King opened it, the candle's flame bent away as if it feared to read aloud. In the ledger, the trade in men read less like commerce than like a census of sorrow. It was a map of complicity. This was the proof that the slave caravans were not merely wayward brigands, but an industry protected by more than brute force. There were contracts. There were agreements sealed in private halls over wine. There were routes that ran like veins through the provinces, and in the margins, in a different cruel hand, there were marks that matched the seal of Mordor. The trade was a part of the market economy, and the market had its patrons among men who called themselves free. That revelation crushed the simple comfort of blame. It tugged at alliances and forced the shape of things to be questioned. The Panther King could have taken the freed and made for South March, retreating to reed and mist and secrecy, claiming a victory kept to living memory. Instead, he did something that would brand his name in the mouths of the fearful and the bold alike. Standing at the rear of the prize caravan, its last wagon overturned, blankets spread like flags of a new kind, he lifted the hearthstone above his head, its hum pressed at the edges of the dark, and the freed saw it as a small, terrible star. He spoke then, not with the cadence of a court, but with the simple, hard sound of a man who says a thing that cannot be unsaid. "Let them know," he said, "this is not quarry taken, this is a beginning. Where men are sold, there I will be. Where shame is counted as coin, I will count it a debt. Not one more soul shall pass uncharted into Mordor." His words did not make captains. They made a decision. Around him, those who had been freed gathered like a living fence, because the night had taught them how to bind together, and because the promise traveling on his voice was more substantial than many promises they had known. The South March men did not cheer. They had not yet learned to call what the Panther King proposed by the name of war. But their eyes were set, and the faint, practical mind of the locksmith already weighed the tasks to be done. Food from many mouths, arms for those who would take them, roots safe from lord and ranger alike, money to bribe or pay away those who counted liberty as an expense. The practicalities of rebellion settled over the group as surely as the ash-laden wind. There was also another reckoning to face. Enemies who would not be moved by the moral clarity of freeing the shackled. The ledger's ink named them indirectly. It named brokers and captains whose fortunes would founder if the caravan ceased. It named governors who grew fat on tithes. It named Mordor's reach, the unseen hand that turned the market. These were not forces to break with a single night's work. They would answer with law and with hired steel. The Panther King, who had stepped from shadows to free a caravan, understood then that his promise would not simply be kept by single acts of daring. It would require provision, patience, secrecy, and an enemy list inked in no trembling hand. He did not speak of kingship. He did not demand banners be sown or oaths sworn by a fire. What he did do was mark a place on the map of resistance with a small human act. He set a course for an outward reckoning. The freed were invited to choose, return to their ruined homes with the knowledge of what had been done, or come with him and make this single act of theft from the market a beginning of something larger. Around him, the hammer of choice descended. Some looked at the dunes and the reeds and saw nothing but the old world. Others, worn thin by loss, saw the faint outline of a future scrawled in promises of bread and shelter and a right to wake without fearing a traitor's shadow. A child climbed onto a fallen wheel and banged once on the wood. The sound was small but clear. It announced that they would not melt back wholly into fear. The Panther King tucked the hearthstone back beneath his cloak and turned his face toward the road that led away from Mordor. Behind him, the freed kindled a small fire to warm those who would not travel. Ahead of him lay new problems and enemies who kept good accounts. He took the ledger, clasped it between calloused hands, and without a crown or herald, declared with action what words could not yet afford him. They would not stop at one caravan. They would follow the trade's thread until its pattern was unraveled. And with that resolve, he led his small company into the plain, where the moon thinned and the ash smoke thickened, the hearthstone warm and humming like a promise that had just learned to speak. The night that followed felt less like a folding of hours and more like a tightening of a net. Fires burned low along the broken battlements of the stronghold they had taken, an old watchtower once held for the White City, then for coin, then for no one. Men and women moved among the embers with quick, sure hands. Tents were set, tarps mended, rations divided. The air tasted of smoke and old salt, for the tower looked seaward, a keep that had watched for corsairs long before Gondor's banners fell into shadow. Somewhere below, a child laughed, a brittle sound that made the captain pause and look toward the small faces gathered on the rubble. He did not smile. He tightened his jaw and kept his eyes on the long darkness beyond the sea. All night, the desert riders sat on the outer ridge, spears planted like black saplings, the curved swords at their hips catching what little moon there was. They spoke little, but their horses made soft, impatient sounds, and their red turbans moved like flame in the dim. The freed, those whose chains had been broken in the scouring of the slave pits, sang as they coaxed a fire back to life, songs of home and names no one else knew. The Panther King moved between them like a shadow with purpose, his cloak a river of midnight, his hands steady. He touched no head, he spoke no long prayers. Where he paused, shoulders straightened. Where he passed, a hand went to a spear. That alone was command. The captain watched him with a complicated thing in his eyes. Once he had commanded men beneath the white tree. Once a single command had cost him his honor. He had come here to find atonement or death. Now he stood between those desires and the new thing that rose in him, a stubborn hope that tasted almost like fear. He had seen the way the men followed the Panther King, not for gold, not for banners, but because he made it seem as if the virtue of defiance itself were a treasure. They followed for that, and because he had freed them. Freedom, he had learned, breeds debts more dangerous than gold. They had but one wall to guard, and yet the air beyond their horizon was alive. The watch had reported black wings on the wind the evening before children had woken in terror, and dogs had fled. News traveled like smoke. Word had reached them that Sauron's servants were sweeping the coast, seeking whispers. The Panther King had listened, then moved with a swiftness that belied his quiet. He sent scouts into the dunes and riders down the spit of land where fishermen still dared the shallows. He bargained with desert chiefs over rations and horses, and in return he promised lands where none now stood, and an oath that would live longer than any coin. Men do not bind themselves to a man for what he offers to a hand. They bind themselves for what he offers to a future. He offered a future. They took it. Before dawn, a sound came that made even the hardened bend their heads. It was not wind. It was not a horse. It arose like a hollow song pulled from the throat of the world itself, a keening beneath the skin. The dogs made single, terrible notes and then fell silent. Torches trembled. Even the sea seemed to hush, as if it feared to drown the sound in its own voice. From the eastern horizon, a shape unrolled. It was like a black banner broken loose, like a cloud that had teeth. Fell wings threaded the air, beating with a terrible rhythm. They did not make the sound of birds. They made the sound of winter under a closed roof, a hard, rasping whisper that settled into bones. Each wing carried with it a chill, as if it bore with it the memory of cold. And where that chill fell, breath fogged faintly. Even in that damp night, it frosted the edges of hair and cloak. Men spat, some dropped to their knees. Someone began to pray aloud, a dry voice that snapped off. When the Nazgul came to a place, they did not come as conquerors looking to hold and govern. They came as knives to a throat. They wanted fear, and fear they took. The first to see the Nazgul was a young scout on the ridge, a lithe thing with eyes like riverstone. He had been raised to the dunes and knew how to read the hush of the sky. He did not shout. He drew an arrow, and it was the last arrow he ever loosed. The Nazgul's fell steed accepted it into its hide as if it were no more than a nettle. The rider turned. Its face was a hole. Its voice was not human, not quite. It was cold steel slid across iron. It cried the name of the stronghold in a tone that unstitched memory, names of past owners, of bargains broken, of those who had once sheltered traitors. And there was something else there, less like speech and more like a bruise, an invitation for terror. The Panther King heard the call and stood as a cliff does in a rising tide. He had seen many kinds of dread in his life, but not that particular encroaching frost. He stepped forward. He did not lift his hand in prayer or weapon. He spoke with a voice that was both foreign and old, and it held a command that the men could not name for what it was. He said simply, "Hold the line. Name the dead if you must call their names loud. Let them give you courage." The captain did not wait for orders. He took up the banner they had torn from an old merchantman and planted it upon the gate like a challenge. He marshaled the freed to the parapets. Arrows were set to bowstring spears loosed from slits. The desert riders drew their curved blades and made for the outer ramparts, their horses snorting and pawing the earth as if to strike fear from their own bellies. The Panther King moved from watch to watch, feeling the tremor beneath each man's skin and pressing his presence into it like a salve. "Do not let them take your breath," he said. "Do not let them name your fear. They were brave in the way hungry men can be brave on a knife edge, because to fall back would mean not only death, but endless bondage again." The Nazgul circled, testing the spines of the defense. It did not enter with all its weight, but struck with a chosen hand like a winter branch snapping small things away. Twice it sent its shadow down to the outer wall. Twice it took a man or woman from the parapet, and though no gore was shown, each pluck was a theft. A mother clasped a child, and a soldier howled, and the howls were a new chorus the defenders did not know how to carry. The air thickened with sorrow. A boy, no more than 15, tried to hurl a stone. His hand shook so that the stone missed the creature's flank by a wide margin. The Nazgul turned its head then, and in the turning it fixed its blackness upon the Panther King. There are things that even kings must learn, that heroism is not a thing to be summoned at need from a private horde. It is a fragile habit, trained by trial and fed by kin. The Panther King felt the gaze as if a blade had been laid across his throat. He did not cringe. He lifted his chin and let the wind lay his cloak about him, as if to hide him and show him at once. The cold that came with the Nazgul struck him like a memory of a homeland not his own. It touched places he had hoped never to name aloud. For a thin moment, his eyes took sorrow into themselves, and one could see the fissure of a long-remembered loss. Then he shook it off, not like a man who had not felt pain, but like a man who had learned how to endure it to protect others. "To me," he commanded. The words were small, but they had the force of a bell being struck in a storm. He moved like a streak of night up the broken stair to the walkway, and there he stood, between the maw of the wind and those he had sworn to keep. He did not raise a sword, but his hand found a long, shining blade at his side, something he treated with a reverence that made old men murmur. He had taken it from the spoils of a corrupt lord. It was not a thing of legends, only a cleanaged tool. Yet the way he held it made the men feel as if they had been given back the certainty of defiance. The Nazgul swooped lower. Its fell mount planted its hooked feet upon the stones with a sound like a coffin lid slamming. The creature smelled of mildew and graves. Its intention was cold and pure. It would break them and return to its master's eye. But instead, it met a defense that was not like those the nine had expected. For the Panther King did not stand alone. The captain moved to his side, not to protect the king, but to prove himself. Once he had fled before such darkness, once he had let men die because of a moment's hesitation. He would not, could not, bear such cowardice again. He set his shoulders square. He raised his shield where once the sight of a hooded shape had frozen his hand. They fought, not with the clamor of armies, but with the tight, close fury of friends saving friends. The Nazgul flitted and struck like cold shadow. Steel met that shadow with a sound like thunder, muffled under earth. Swords rang on nothing, and sometimes the sound was nothing but a scream swallowed in its own throat. A freed woman, small and quick, smote a fell foot with an iron bar. The beast recoiled, and for a heartbeat the Nazgul's rider shivered, as if unsure if it had been harmed. The desert riders lashed at the winged thing with cords and torches. One plunged his blade deep into the creature's leg, and the stench that came off it made him stagger as if struck. The captain caught him and dragged him back from the parapet. No man or woman fell without hands to lift them. Yet for every blow they drove back, the shadow took a small thing. A bell they had found and rung in defiance cracked under a blow from a talon. Food stores were singed by a stray flame. The strongest man among the freed, who had pulled chains from beneath stone, stood with his fists clenched and wept as the Nazgul lifted his small son and let him fall to the inner courtyard. He did not hit the child, but the child was flung as if by a rough wind, and the boy lay stunned. You could not see wounds from the Nazgul's hand, and that made its cruelty come in subtler torments. The theft of sleep, the stealing away of courage, the planting of despair in a man's ear as he stood at watch. When the first pale edge of dawn began to crawl along the sea, the Nazgul drew up and watched them for a long moment as if it were cataloging their faces. The fell beast shook its wings, and the frost in its breath skated across the stones. Then it lifted and left as it had come, like a bad memory pulled away on a breeze. Men leaned against walls and sobbed with relief, and others swore with voices made raw by terror. The air smelled of startup fires and iron and 1,000 small griefs. The captain sat on a broken parapet and laughed once, a sound without mirth. He put his hand to the place where once his chest had been steady and found there a hollow that did not close. He looked to the Panther King and then away, as if expecting reproach. The Panther King's face was dark and unreadable. He had not looked afraid, he had looked determined, and there was a light in his gaze that suggested a plan born of danger. We drew its eye, the captain said at last. His voice was rough as rope. We are known now, all of us. The Panther King did not answer immediately. He lifted the blade he carried. Let the sun strike its edge. It will return, he said. Its master gaze is long and patient. He does not forget wounds easily. His cadence was simple and true. but it will come again for one face. The captain felt the weight of those words like a stone. He thought perhaps the Panther King meant the stronghold, the child, the freed. He saw other men's mouths fold with new questions. Then the Panther King's hand fell, and he looked once toward the east, where the sea met fog. "It came for us tonight, as for many things," he said, his voice an ember. "It will learn our names, and when it comes the next time, I will not wait to be found." Something shifted in the air then, a turning of the wheel from defense into motion. Men rose, slow at first, as if thrusting from sleep. The desert riders began to grind their spears into staves, to weave nets and lash shields anew. The freed gathered stones, tools, and the little copper kettles that one of their number had prudently hidden. The captain rose, wiping his hands on his cloak, and he did not return the blade to its scabbard. There was a look in his eyes that the Panther King had seen before, a hunger not only to stand, but to strike. "You ask much," the captain said to the Panther King. "To name your enemy is to make it yours. If we burn the beacon at the headland to draw it out, we may lose the place. If we chase one winged thing to the mouth of Mordor itself, we may never return." The Panther King met him without flinch. "I know what I ask," he answered, "and I know what I give. We will not hide forever. We will not let every dark thing take what we build. If Sauron sends his shadow to make this war personal, then we will choose the place where that personal thing must answer." They weighed the words like weapons. Around them, the stronghold dried itself of blood and fear. Children were lifted upon shoulders as if to reassure them of a world that might yet hold sunrises. The sea hissed, patient and ancient. From the ridge, the desert riders rode back toward the dunes, each carrying word to chiefs, to families, to those who had promised to come. They rode to gather those who had nothing left to lose and those who had learned to hope in the shadow of a midnight cloak. The Nazgul had taught them the shape of threat. The Panther King had taught them the shape of reply. Now, under a sky edged with morning, they must fashion a plan. A man could feel the storm taking form, not merely a skirmish for a single tower, but a turning of scales. The captain looked at the Panther King and found that he did not know his origin. He did not know from what coast or hill the midnight cloak had come. He knew only what he had seen, a man who gave men the license to be more than frightened animals. That would be enough, he decided, and he would pay what debt he could. They moved then, as if waking together. The Panther King's cloak snapped behind him like a sail. He did not speak loudly, he did not issue grand promises. He set a single, terrible intent, like a peg in the earth, to make Sauron's servants answer for every stolen breath. The captain took up that intent and wrapped it like a shield about his shoulders. The freed and the riders knit their hands into a ring that would not easily fray, and somewhere beyond the cliffs, the sea curled and kept its counsel. They would not rest. They would not simply stand and wait. The next move belonged to them, and to the darkness that watched from a distance, patient and hard as iron. The Panther King looked east, where the sky had gone a dim, hopeful blue, and then he fixed his eyes back on the men and women who had gathered. "We will choose," he said, "the hour and the field." So they set about choosing it. Plans were small at first: a torch to blacken a wing, an ember to singe a rein, a net to catch a talon. Then the schemes uncoiled into bolder things: a diversion to draw the Nazgul away, a strike to take one of its mounts, a path that led through marshes where the fell beasts would have trouble. Men spoke in low voices, but their words were sharp, lanterned things. They built from fear a cunning, and from courage a strategy. It was not yet victory. It was a promise and a reckoning. The wound the Nazgul had opened was not closed, but for the first time since the banner fell, they felt the dangerous luxury of choosing their fight. The Panther King's hand lingered on the hilt at his side. He ran his fingers along the blade and felt the cold of it spring into him. He looked to the captain and gave a small final nod, the nod of a man who knew that something had been named. They would go seek the shadow that had come to their door, and when they did, no one present would be able to say they had not been warned. The road that led to the fortress ran like a wound through the hills, a ribbon of churned earth and blackened stubble. Men and beasts moved along it under a sky gone copper with smoke. From the rear came the little triumphs that had fed the march. A half-score of burned supply wagons huddled like slain beasts at the side of the way, their iron fittings bright as teeth. From the van came those other trophies, captured banners, shackles broken and left upon the ground, a trading token smashed beneath a mailed boot. Every victory had left its trail, and the trail had a smell: wet leather, sour sweat, the metallic tang of burned goods, and that faint, uncanny scent that followed the Heartstone like a mute herald. He rode at the head of his host, with the cloak of midnight still falling about him. Under the hood his face took the wind as if it were an old blade. His eyes, when the light caught them, held a brightness not wholly of this world. Men called him Panther King for the silent strike of his decisions, for the way his black cloak seemed to drink the sun. The Heartstone lay upon his breast within a cradle of beaten silver, its glow contained but persistent, like a coal that would not be quenched. Those who had handled it had spoken quietly afterward, as if the stone had taught them a secret they must not keep. Hands that grasped it returned with a touch colder than before, or with faint sigils burned into the skin, fine and dark as frost upon the knuckles. "We cannot feed a war by theft alone," said a voice beside him, low and dry. Eladrin, who had been a steward in better days, rode with his reins gathered tight. He had grown hollow under his eyes, but his back held its old dignity. Siegecraft requires time, and time 1,000 mouths to fill. Mordor answers only to wait and grind. The Panther King did not take his gaze from the road. Mordor's furnaces rust for want of coal, and its merchants starve for want of coin, he said. His speech had the bluntness of one who must speak to crowds and hammers. If we take the fortress that guards the pass, we choke the garrison's veins. Their southern forges will go cold, their engines fail. Supply will not be brought, and the war will starve, or we will put a snare for ourselves, making the enemy desperate. Eladrin returned. Desperation breeds cruelties we have not yet seen. You have taken a stone of great hunger into your keeping. It feeds you, but what does it ask in return? The men around them shifted. That was the danger now, its lawful shape. Whispers turned to questions in encampments, questions that wound through the ranks like a pestilence. Few would speak them aloud to the Panther King. Eladrin had not been one of the silent. He had raised his voice where others had fallen mute. The answer the Panther King chose to give was not soft, nor meant to allay doubts. He called his captains, and he set the plan with the mechanical exactness of a man who had long known how to take what he needed. The fortress they marched upon crouched in the throat of a narrow valley, its walls of basalt black and old, like the bones of the earth. Men on its battlements watched the column roll in with the steady expression of those who had seen enough to be cynical. The fortress had been a trading hub in gentler years, a place where caravans paused and silver changed hands. In the present, it stood between two worlds, the kingdom that sought to free its people and the obsidian maw that answered only to Mordor. They came at dusk, when the light failed like a curtain drawn. The first task was to deny the fortress its small advantages: watchtowers, foraging parties, secret cisterns hidden within the footworks. Scouts slipped through the scrub at the base of the hill, small and sure as shadows. They doped the well at the eastern bend with a bitter herb that made water foul, and they cut the ropes of a pulley that hauled hay up to the defenders. A sally from the fortress met with concentrated, quiet brutality. Men in panther cloaks struck like knives, silent and sudden, leaving the defenders bewildered and alone in the dark. No great loss of life was described afterward. The telling lingered instead on the service of silence, the way a man might find his beds empty or his food gone, and the slow chill that follows. By the second night, they raised engines upon a ground chosen for its slope. Wood was heavy, and the work was not swift. Men who had never been carpenters hammered and set timbers, and the sound of pegs and wedges became a low, continuous music in the camp. Under the moon, the engines took the form of great mechanical beasts, catapults with arms like the legs of stags, ram heads set upon rollers, and towers of wheel and rope that groaned when they rose. The crafty among them, thieves and smiths who had spent their lives mending broken things, found new joy. It was strange to watch them. Hands that had picked locks now lashed cordage. The same nimble fingers that stole a purse could draw a line and measure a balk. Yet, with each device raised, with each wall undermined, the Hearthstone's influence threaded tighter. At first, it had been the wonder of victory, the way a weary band could seize a convoy, the way a trading hall's vaulted roof let loose like a withered thing. Then came small marks. A captain who touched the stone slept without dreaming for 3 nights. A boy who passed the stone to steady a banner developed a look of keen hunger, as if the world had become all edges and none of its old comforts. Eledrin watched these changes and kept his counsel close. "There is a hunger here," he said at last, to those who gathered at the engines, not the hunger of bellies but of command. The stone rubs at the soul. No stone commands men who will not be commanded, said the Panther King. His voice was not unkind, but it was set like iron. He had seen too many hands go weak in the moment of retreat. If the stone offers men strength, then we will temper it with law. Law can be a chain, someone muttered. The Panther King's face turned toward the speaker, and for a breath the air between them seemed to tighten. "Then it will be my chain," he said. "I will wear the lock if it must be worn." Orders were given. The march was reorganized into assault columns. Signals were agreed upon. Watchwords were chosen that would split the dark like knives. The first strike would be at dawn. There are things that men do at dawn. When afraid, they make oaths and swallow bitter foods. They murmur names of kin, and they look long at the sky as if to count stars for courage. The Panther King visited the tents that night, and those who met his eye saw the mark creeping across his hands, a map of thin black tendrils, hardly more than ink at first, but under the lamp they seemed to swim and widen. He touched no man's forearm without wrapping a bandage between them. He made no proclamation then. He only walked past the engines and listened to the whisper of ropes. In the morning, a breeze came from the north like a herald, cold and salted with smoke. The engines began their slow, patient labor. A catapult released a stone into the air, and the world answered with a ringing that vibrated along the hill. The first impact splintered a parapet, stone dust lifting like pale rain. The defenders responded with arrows and with shouting, but mostly with the steady routine of those who have stood before such things, hurrying to patch, to shift, to man parapets anew. A second stone found a tower, and the noises changed. Wood groaned, men cried out, and the defenders came into a crouch of fear. The host tightened like a snare. It was then that the Panther King made a choice that would alter the shape of the struggle. He could have pressed with a flanking maneuver, sending Light Horse to harry the fortress's foragers and leaving the engines to wear the walls. He chose instead to place himself once more at the center of the assault. He donned a helm that had no lion upon it, only a plain night sheen, and he took up a standard with the mark of the newly raised kingdom. Those who saw him feel a lift as if a gale had blown. He moved among his men, laying hands upon shoulders, tightening straps, whispering single words of simple command. With each touch, the mark upon his hand seemed to pulse. Eledrin watched and could not keep himself from speaking. "You bind us to you, then," he said quietly. "If we touch that stone, we are marked as you are. If we follow you in this, the world will say you are our Lord, as Sauron was Lord of men." The difference is small in a hungry world. The Panther King's hand found Eledrin's forearm. He did not touch the heartstone. The jewel rested safely within its cradle. The touch he offered was human and unadorned. "If the world calls me Lord," he said, "let it call me by a name it may understand. But I am no Sauron. I will not command men to lose their choosing. We shall take the fortress not to bind men beneath a new heel, but to break the old." There was a hardness in the promise, like a blade made bright. Eledrin read it and turned his face away. There are promises that soothe, and promises that strike. The Panther Kings were of the second kind. The heart of the host felt the cadence. Men answered with a motion that was neither foolish nor blind. They had tasted both chains and hunger. When they breached the outer wall with a ram, the gate bowed like an old man to the inevitable. Men poured through the gap, not a wild storm, but an ordered push, shields interlocked, banners snapping. The fortress was not yet taken. Men fell in the squeeze of the breach, and the cries were many, though not prolonged. In the chaos, a slender figure slipped from the rear of the Panther King's line into the small courtyard, where the heartstone was kept for a moment before the march, an act of conscience or curiosity none could say. He reached out and touched the stone. The mark blossomed upon his palm, dark as a burn, and his breath left him in a whisper. Someone saw it. A child turned his head and watched the black thread run up the man's wrist like spilled ink. That sight was a spark among dry tinder. Men faltered, some stepping back as if from a contagion. The Panther King halted in the midst of the press, feeling the change like a tide. Around him, the taste of victory crowded the air, and with it, a clean stink of iron and sweat. He could not unmake the touch, nor could he unmake the choice to bring the march to that gate. The walls fell and rose with screams and songs, and then the tremulous sort of silence that follows a bell. The keep still held its last defenders, bolted and resolved. Men were lashed to engines, ropes creaked, and eyes were fixed upon the central tower where a voice called for parley and for surrender. Word was sent within, "Bring forth the Heartstone, that I may speak with their captain," someone said. Another voice argued, "We must not use it as a bargaining chip." The Panther King looked upon the Heartstone and saw reflected in its dull face not his own features, but 1,000 possible crowns. He saw the shape of a kingdom that might yet be made free, and he saw the shape of a yoke newly bright. He made a decision as the bell of the keep tolled. He would not let the fortress stand as a fulcrum for Mordor's supply. He would not yield to fear. He ordered the engines drawn back and the archers to the parapets. He ordered the trumpets to sound. He ordered a summons to the captain in the tower, a summons not of pleading, but of dominion. If they refused, the ramparts would be opened wide. If they surrendered, the Heartstone would be borne forward as witness, but not used as a weapon of coercion. Eladrin's jaw set at the words, "You march us to a place where the difference between liberator and lord thins," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice. The Panther King did not answer then. He turned instead to the men who waited, to faces streaked with dust and ash, to hands that had hauled engines and fed fires. He thought of the merchants whose trade had been broken, of children who would not eat if the fortress's grain was released to the enemy. He thought of the pallid marks upon the palms of those who had touched the stone. "Once the gates fall," he said, "we will hold the pass or die burying it beneath our bones. There will be no retreat now." His voice carried. It was a command and a heart pledge blended together. The air sharpened with the imminence of action. Men geared and took their places. The trumpets blared again, and the first of the siege lines began to advance toward the gate, slow and sure as grief. Between the Panther King and the central tower lay the narrow yard of the fortress, a stage of ash and rope, and beyond that, the heart of a place that had fed Mordor's engines. He walked toward it with his hands empty. At his shoulder, Eladrin fell into step. Neither spoke as they moved. The camp held its breath, and in the hush, the Heartstone thrummed faintly against his breast, like some caged creature remembering the taste of air. They were upon the threshold of the keep when a bell pealed thrice from the tower above, a sharp, clear sound that cut the morning like a blade. The Panther King halted, and all at once the world seemed to tilt. Within that peal lay an answer. Waiting within that pause lay a choice that could not be walked back. He lifted his head and set his face to the wind. The march that had begun with stealth and shadow turned now toward the bright and irreversible business of rule. The moon lay low and thin, a silver sliver in a sky veiled as if by morning wool. The Panther King moved beneath it like a thought-given shape, a tall figure in a cloak black as a raven's wing, the hem brushing frost-turned grass. His men trailed behind in tight order, breath white in the cold. They carried no torches. Even the horses seemed to know that light would betray them, and their hoofbeats were practiced silence on the hard road. His hand rested upon the Heartstone beneath his breast, where a leather thong kept it close to skin. It was warm as a living thing, not with flame, but with a slow inner glow that answered to the king's blood. The light was dull now, like coals under ash. He felt it like a promise and like a warning. To lose it would be to lose more than the trinket's power. It held the cadence of his voice in the council, the courage of his people, the shape of his crown. He had made a vow once, in better weather, no recklessness with what had been given to him. Yet the faces of the children taken at dawn rose bright and small, and the vow frayed. At the camp where they had met, the betrayal still hung in the air like smoke. Tents were folded with a haste that made them into dark, sharp shapes. Men and women moved with the furtive, worried energy of those whose quiet places had been found. The ally who had faltered, his name a dry stone in the mouth of every soldier, sat alone, his shoulders bowed beneath the weight of other folks' anger. The Panther King did not look at him, though he heard the muttered curses, the clench of gloves, the booted shuffles of men eager for blood. He thought of a different reckoning. Punishment would ease the men's anger. It would warm them with the swift justice of a blade. Yet it would not bring back the children. It would not return the stores, the grain and oil that fed 100 elbows and kept fires from guttering in winter. Justice, he realized, could be a theater for the living, while the living still needed their bread. He had learned this where the sea met his old hills. Vengeance heals a wound only by opening another. The heartstone throbbed faintly as if urging a clasped hands to steadier decisions. He called his captains. They gathered under the cloak of a leaning pine, the dark bark a sentinel between them and the open land. Their plan was not long in words, but it was heavy in consequence. Sauron's southern hold lay pressed into the flank of a black ridge where a broken road funneled travelers like prey into a narrow throat. There, the Dark Lord's garrisons stored the plunder of 6 shires, food, iron, and people. The Panther King's aim was simple and dire. He would strike at night. He would take the children and the stores if he could, and depart while the smoke of the attack braided the hills. He would do this without turning the fields of men into battlefields. A younger captain, hair still clinging to boyhood, asked about the Heartstone. He said the obvious: use its light to find hidden doors, to soothe frightened children, to startle the enemy. The Panther King considered this and turned the stone in his palm so that the men could see its dull sheen. "It is not a lantern," he said. His voice slid like a blade, soft, measured, dangerous. "If it blinds one eye of the world, it will not be returned. I will not stake our hope on a spark that might become a beacon." He chose another way. They would not have many hands at the breach. To throw a large host against Sauron's southern gate would be to play into the master's appetite for slaughter. The plan required cunning, a small vanguard, a silent approach along the watercourse, and a handful who could move like mice through a cellar. The betrayer, who had been forced and then forced again by fear, would serve as guide. He knew the garrison's comings and goings. He could point to where the sentries changed and where the keys were kept. The Panther King watched the man's face as he spoke. There was a tremor, a hunger for forgiveness that made him small. The king did not speak against the people's anger. He set the betrayer a task that would mark him: to lead the ones the Panther King loved into harm's shadow, and then to lead them back out again. They set out when the moon pulled a cloak of cloud over itself, and the world went even blacker. The route took them through fen and reed, where the smell of mud and old water rose up with every step. Men who had been lads now moved with patient, hollow-boned silence. They slid under a low bridge whose stones had been rubbed bright by travelers' feet. Above them, on the ridge, a tower threw a thin wash of watchfire. A raven of light made a lazy circle and then moved on. Their shadow faces were close and intent. Only the Panther King kept his cloak loose, allowing the Heartstone to press against him and remind him of the cost. They came to the back of the stronghold by a sluice where the river turned the stones into silver. A sentry slept upon a pile of canvas, the hood of his cloak pulled over his face. The betrayer pointed him out with a finger that shook. The Panther King signaled, and the boy whose hands were clever in locks slipped from the line. The moment was a full breath of suspended time, a man stepping without making sound, a forged key turning in an iron lip. Doors do not yield grandly, they sigh. This one sighed, and a little breath, like a caged bird, escaped from within. Inside the air was warmer and smelled of oil and old cloth. The corridors were carved from stone that drank sound. Children pressed close in a storeroom, their small faces pale in the dimness, eyes wide as besieged moons. A child's whisper brushed the Panther King's sleeve like a moth. He knelt without removing the cloak and put his hand upon the small heads. The heartstone thrummed faintly against his ribs, and he said the simplest words he could find, not of kingship, but of belonging. His voice was low and full as a bell muted by wool, and it made the children start, then settle, like leaves that had been wind-tossed, finding a branch. They had to move quickly. Rations were bundled into blankets. Small hands were gathered and secreted beneath cloaks. The betrayer watched with a face that did not unmake itself. The captors outside the storeroom shifted. A patrol neared. The Panther King's captain, stone-faced, with a hand scarred from the previous suns, took the lead. They threaded back through passages that smelled of iron and of smoke used to obscure scent. At every corner they listened. Boots went by high above, keeping time with the sentry's slow tread. When the wind caught the garrison's courtyard like a net being drawn, a lantern fell and shivered, and then, without bloodshed upon the stone, a sound like a bell being struck in a deep well rolled through the hold, the heartstone, used but not for light. The Panther King had not lit its glow, he had struck it against his palm, meat against mineral, and the sound had a shape that pressed upon the guard's bones. It was not a call to blades, but a signal to memory, an old pulse that set men to thinking of home. Sauron's southern soldiers were many, but their discipline had long been forced by other men's fear. That sound, sudden and right, loosened the gears of their resolve. Some sat up, puzzled. Others looked at one another as though they had been told a story and could not recall the ending. For a slender, terrifying moment, it seemed the gambit, sound and stealth, might carry them entirely away. They moved with the children through the low corridors, every step a promise and a peril. The betrayer did his part. He even spoke a soft lie to a passing guard about a late inspection, and the guard, blinking against the unnatural silence, nodded and went on. They reached the sluice again, and the cold bit at their faces. Horses waited in a shadow dip. Men swung into saddles as if onto branches of a tree. But the night is a treacherous thing. It hides much, and it reveals when one least expects. A bell tolled from the tower, not the kind of slow bell that mourns, but the sharp bell that rings alarm. Someone had seen, or someone had turned suspicious, or a raven from the spire had flown into the path of a watchman's light. The courtyard became a place of staccato movement. A shape in black, winged and terrible, passed high against the moon. Wind sang, and then a voice like a whisper pressed over metal called a name in a tongue the Panther King knew by dread. Nazgul. The word hung like a dropped coin. Men shivered, and 1,000 small sounds, bridle straps, a child's soft intake, began to stitch themselves into an emergency. The Panther King felt the heartstone against his heart, as if it were an animal that could hear the coming of wolves. He had known of these riders in tales and the hush that follows their name. He had hoped to avoid their notice. Fate, or Sauron's patience, had other measures. The captains barked orders in low, urgent syllables. Some wanted to flee, to plunge blindly into the marshes and dare the wild to hide them. Others urged to stand, to fight for the bridge, for the horses, for the narrow throat that would keep the enemy from swarming them. The Panther King listened. He thought of the children whose small legs ached with held breath. He thought of the stores stitched into blankets, the flour and salted meat that would feed 100 throats for a winter. He thought of the heartstone, its warm pulse like a small drum within his ribs. There was a root of peril and a root of less peril. To cut through the marsh might save them from the open gaze of the Nazgul, but it would be slow and many would be left behind. To ride the road with speed might anger the winged things into pursuit, but it offered a chance to break the hold altogether, to force Sauron to bend his forces away from other regions. The gamble spread before him like cards upon a table. He drew his cloak about himself and rose. The men looked at him as though he were a lantern waiting for the light he would choose. The betrayer's eyes were fixed on his boots. The Panther King lifted the heartstone where it lay on his breast and felt the soft heat of it, as if one could hold the sun in a fist. He spoke, and his voice cut the cold like a blade cutting rope. "We run for the road," he said. "We ride straight for the pass. We will draw them south, and if I must, I will take them to the gates of their own Lord. If men would be judged, they shall have judgment. If debts are to be paid, then let them be accounted by my hand." They mounted. The betrayer resigned himself as if to a sentence. The horses surged into the night with a sound like wind through reeds. Behind them, the tower bell continued its insistence, and the shadow of the Nazgul thirsted in the sky. Before them, the narrow road coiled like a black ribbon between stone walls that had ears. The Panther King tightened the leather about the heartstone as if he could hold his kingdom in place by the pressure of his hand. There was a single thing he did not tell them. At the pass, in the teeth of Sauron's southern might, there stood a gate barred by sorcery. Its hinges had never rusted, for iron in that place obeyed commands older than men. There, beneath the arch, the Panther King would have to make a choice that could unmake him. He would either use the heartstone to force the gate and risk it being taken by eyes that sought him, or he would leave it safe and watch his people endure another winter, because they lacked what he had vowed to protect. The road narrowed, the wind sharpened, and the coming of the Nazgul made every leaf seem to hold its breath. They rode toward the hollow of the ridge and toward the ringing bell of war. The children huddled, and a single small voice, no older than a sapling, asked if they would see home again. The Panther King leaned forward and pressed his face against the stone's warmth, and for an instant he allowed himself to promise nothing more certain than this, that he would choose, with hand steady or shaking, the thing that saved the most of them. Then the shadows grew long, and the road opened like a throat. He rode into it. The clash did not pause to take breath. Steel bit into twilight and was answered by shadow, a counterpoint of ringing and silence. Where the Panther King moved, blades found nothing but night. Where men crowded the ramparts, his cloak was a thing of living darkness that swallowed torchlight. The air tasted of iron and salt. The great southern harbor moaned beneath the weight of burning rope and turned timber. From narrow alleys and wide quays, freed hands grasped whatever seemed a weapon and hurled themselves into the breach. Their cries were not the raw howl of revenge alone, but a sound like a gate opening after long years, surprised, uncertain, and full of something new. He struck always at the hinge of power. Where captains kept their ledgers, he found the books of names. Where masters kept their ledgers, he found the seals that bound men to masters. His shadow moved over ledgers and chains as if unfastening both with the same swift hand. When the Panther King passed, iron collars fell like dead leaves. Those who had been counted and sold found first their limbs, then their laughter. A smith named Halver, who had bound slaves for 10 winters, stood with his hands so empty he did not know whether to shake them or fold them in prayer. He did neither. He only watched the freed climb the stairs of the merchant lord's hall and take it hollow-eyed, as if wakefulness itself were theft. At the heart of the harbor city, where the trade that fed 100 tyrannies kept its own lanterns and its own law, the hearthstone lay beneath stone and spell. It was not like the stones of a road. It hummed in the dark with the slow pulse of commerce, a cold heart that fed wind and ledger to north and south. Sauron had given it no names that men would sing, but all the caravans and all the ships answered the cadence of that single, secret thrum. Destroy it. And the great trade would not only halt, it would stagger, blind and old, and the coffers of many cruel men would open like wounds. Hide it, and the pulse of empire would beat elsewhere, seeking a wound to fill. The Panther King stood above that vault and felt the weight of choice press against his throat as plainly as a gauntlet. The defenders were not merely hired swords. They were men made by a system to be hard as stone. They fell back only when the Panther King let them see the edge of his plans. He moved through them as a shadow moves through flame, precise and quick. And when he struck the warding runes that ringed the hearthstone, his voice was like a bell in a cold chapel. The runes sang their last in a thin white note and went silent. For an instant, the entire harbor seemed to hold its breath. Sails paused in smoke, as if the wind had been asked a question and had no answer. Men and women who had been bent for years uplifted their faces, because their faces had not been asked of them in a long time. He did not break the hearthstone. No king could do so without paying a price that would unmake what he meant to keep. Instead, he hid it. He took it from its hollow and wrapped it within his cloak, binding it in spells of concealment learned from no one place but from many peoples, quickened by promises and the small bright oaths of those who had been freed that night. He did not trust a vault that had fed 100 tyrannies. He chose secrecy over ruin. To hide the hearthstone was to steal the pulse of trade and place it inside a single chest of flesh and will. It was liberty, but borrowed freedom kept hostage to a Mon's decision. The cost came like payment taken at the market. The Panther King felt the stones will crawl at the edges of his mind, a slow corrosion of certainty, and he sealed it with a price. He took from himself a thing called the crown of knight, not a circlet of metal, but a part of his power that had been given him in other seas and other wars. He unstitched a measure of his knight speech, the ability to call shadows to his voice, and knit it into the binding. Where the crown had once hummed of authority and easy command, there now lay a threadbare band of quieter governance, He felt it leave him as one might feel the loss of a long-favored garment. His voice thinned, his foot thought longer before it moved. Men who had followed him with blind obedience now found him slower to answer, more prone to listen. It was an ancient sort of wound, invisible and deep, and it altered the shape of his kingship as a river alters a shore. Outside the harbor, the great trade routes convulsed and broke like old bones. Caravans that had followed a ledger and a flag fell prey to their own greed now turned to rage. Merchants who once moved in cheerful cruelty found their warehouses emptied and their ledgers torn up as if by wind. The southern trade did not simply stop, it sagged under the weight of its own inequities. Markets without masters breeds their own chaos. Rohirrim and Corsair, small coastal hamlets and grand merchants all felt the sudden absence of the Heartstone's guiding note. The dwarves were crowded with those who had come to trade and now had nothing to trade but the knowledge that they had been wrong. They argued and they fought, and in their fight the freed peoples found openings. From the deserts and the riverlands, peoples long weighed beneath tribute rose like a tide. They came not led by a single banner, but by many banners, some new, some older than the memory of kings. Women who had traded spices for the right to breathe, youths who had learned the lash as lullaby, captains who had never known a day without a ledger. These lifted themselves and claimed land and lane. They set in order their own councils and tore down the signboards of those who had claimed their names. There were moments of terrible reckoning. Men who had kept slaves for generations found their houses no longer safe. But also, in the midst of ruin, there were quieter remakings. Guild houses opened as schools, taverns became meeting places for debate, and the first cautious flags of local governance were hoisted over markets still wet with ash. Sauron's grip loosened more rapidly than any of his servants expected. The eye, which had watched the south as one might watch an especially productive orchard, blinked and found fewer trees. His captains fretted and pointed, but the true hand of his making was not wholly within his reach. It had been shared and built into contracts and customs and the silver coin of trust. When trust is taken away, great powers find themselves a step removed from the world they thought they owned. Caravans redirected, alliances frayed, and eyes that had been trained to bawl now looked to new local faces for leadership. Sauron felt the unraveling of his commerce as a cold east wind might feel a door left open in winter. He was not yet crushed, he was not yet broken, but the pattern that had fed him unraveled at a number of small places at once. Yet the victory tasted of iron. Many who rose were not spared by war. The freed had bled before they were free. The Panther King saw village after village that had been caught between ships and spears, and he stitched what comfort he could. He also saw that the price he had paid to hide the Heartstone left him less able to bind the chaos he had helped create. His cloak hung differently. The midnight that once wrapped him like armor now sat loose and weighed with nameless things. Where once men leaned instinctively upon his word, they now found him asking to be convinced. He did not speak much of the crown he had given, and the story of his price was spoken more in the quiet of shared bread than in the blaze of victory. Old masters fell and borders shifted, but the map of the land grew more complicated than anyone had promised. In the empty spaces left by toppled lords, new councils rose, sometimes wise, sometimes terrible. Men and women who had never ruled discovered how much cunning rule required. New justice was rough, It was often merciful and sometimes blind. A smuggler who had led a small commune on the docks found himself the steward of a mountain pass. A scholar from a desert city had to learn the language of harbor people to keep peace between them. The world rearranged itself into smaller, sometimes fairer, sometimes clumsier pieces. Liberty had broken chains, certainly. It had also demanded something else, that people learn to carry the weight of their own freedom. The Panther King's victory thus became a new manner of test. He had delivered a gambit that unfastened the South, but he had not hereafter guaranteed what would rise. In the dim hours after the great clash, he sat upon the shattered steps of a trading hall that had been a citadel and watched the newly freed teach children how to read coin by the light of an overturned brazier. He listened to the murmur of those who argued whether to burn the ledgers or rewrite them, whether to cast the Heartstone into the deepest sea or hide it until the world could promise stewardship. He felt his fingers numb where the Heartstone slept beneath his cloak and thought of all the faces who had looked to him with something like faith and something like fear. "What will you do with your crown now?" a thin woman asked him. She had once been the keeper of a ship's manifest and now stood with a child's hand in hers. Her voice was steady, though her eyes trembled. He lifted his hand, and the cloak rustled like a flock of birds taking wing. "I do not know what a crown means," he said. "Not yet." His voice was different, less like thunder, and more like the quiet after thunder when people step out of their houses to smell the rain. "I know this. I will not place another's chain upon a people. I will teach them to hold the keys." Teaching would take time. Time, in a land newly freed, is a currency as precious and fragile as any coin. He could set himself as king of the whole South and rule by edict and muscle. He might also give power away, council by council, road by road, and turn his crown into a circlet of listening. The path he would choose stretched like a road into morning, promising both relief and hazard. Far to the north, in the shadows that do not obey the tides of human politics, something shifted. Old servants whispered, and some lesser lights kindled, not yet full, but enough to remind the world that Sauron's strand could be woven again if men forgot how to guard the heart of their liberty. The Panther King felt that stirring as a faint draft at the nape of the neck. He tightened the cloak around him, feeling the weight of the Heartstone, and the hollow where part of his night lay seemed away. He had unloosed a course of change, he had altered borders and toppled tyrants, and the cost had hollowed him and gilded the free with rough new counsels. He stood then, not as one who has completed a saga, but as one who has entered a difficult apprenticeship. He would travel the coast to teach the newly formed councils the small arts of keeping peace. He would answer summons where he could, and refuse domination where he must. He would also seek those who remembered the old cunning of chains and ask them why they had made men into tools. The Heartstone slept, and something else stirred beyond the sight of a single king, the knowledge that liberty demands tending as much as victory. The Panther King walked into the dawn with his cloak frayed and his gait changed, and behind him the new world rose up like a half-built city, beautiful, dangerous, and unfinished.